The Coming of Conan the Cimmerian by Robert E. Howard. Book review. Sorry, actually I'm not sure on the pronunciation. Cimmerian or Cimmerian, I don't know. But this is a collection of the 13 Conan stories. Robert E. Howard in his lifetime never published this book. This is a compilation book of short stories he had written, published after his death. These are the Conan the Barbarian stories, which everybody knows Conan the Barbarian from movies, I think. So yeah, these were originally pulp fiction, published in the 1930s in kind of popular magazines. I've been working my way through some of the classics of pulp fiction recently. I've done the Insidious Dr. Fu Manchu, the John Carter of Mars books, the Sherlock Holmes books. Is that pulp fiction? I don't know. I mean, I know they're classics as well, but they were also published as, you know, detective stories in popular magazines. They were kind of, I don't know. So anyways, this is a collection of Conan stories published by publisher Del Rey. And right from the beginning, like when you pick it up and look at the back cover and you open up the publisher's introduction, they make a huge deal about the fact that they are the only publishers to publish together these Conan stories in the order that they were written originally. Apparently what every other publisher has done is publish them chronologically. But they're making a big selling point about here you can read them in the order they were written. I actually found it a little bit confusing to read these books in the order they were written, because the chronology is just jumping all over the place. Sorry, I said books. These stories in the order they were written. Anyways, the chronology is jumping all over the place. So in one book, Conan will be a king, and in the next book he's like a petty thief. And I had a little bit of a hard time cluing into what was going on initially, and the publisher's introduction didn't really give me a lot of help with this. But apparently what's going on is that Conan has had this whole cycle throughout his life, where he goes from barbarian to warrior to thief to outlaw to mercenary to pirate, and then somehow he ends up as king eventually. And so Robert E. Howard is just kind of picking up different stories from different points in Conan's life and writing them all out of order. Now, I don't know if this would make more sense or not if it was arranged chronologically. And I haven't read all the Conan stories, so I don't know if there are stories that fill in the gaps, or if even in chronological order you just have to kind of jump from situation to situation. Conan's character. He's a shaggy-haired muscle man with a sword who just fights his way out of all the difficulties. Thinking of like this huge overgrown muscle man with a bit shaggy hair and a sword, I couldn't help but imagine He-Man. And I'm old enough that I grew up with the He-Man cartoons in the 1980s. And sure enough, I go to Wikipedia, and there are allegations that He-Man started out as an adaptation of Conan the Barbarian, which then later got sanitized for school children. There are also different tales of He-Man's origin stories, so I don't know, take that with a grain of salt. But maybe that's how He-Man got his start. Of course, the morality is completely different. You remember from the He-Man cartoons, He-Man would always give you a moral lesson at the end. Conan is completely amoral. He's like an anti-hero in that way. He often kind of will end up doing some good, but he's always looking out for himself. So the plot of each of these Conan short stories, the plot's not particularly remarkable. If you just go by the plot, it's pretty much the same plot every time, and it's pretty predictable. What will happen is Conan will just get confronted by some sort of overwhelming danger, or just like danger kind of piled on danger. Usually Sometimes he's just fighting off men, but usually there's some sort of supernatural thing going on that he's got to fight against. And then he's able to get his way out of the situation by just pure muscle. So it's just his muscles, his determination, and just his pure manliness. And he just fights out of every situation. So there's no like plot twist, or there's no like, you know, it's not like using his wits to get out of it in like some way you never thought. He just kind of muscles through everything. In spite of all that, I'm going to recommend these books. One is just, as with any good fantasy book, the appeal isn't so much the plot, the appeal is the world of the fantasy. And Robert E. Howard does a good job of creating this world that you want to get immersed in. There are appendices in the back of this Del Rey edition, which kind of show all the planning out he did of this world and all the different civilizations. Conan himself wanders through several different countries. His origins as a barbarian are described as kind of a barbarian coming from the northern snowy lands. And it's, at least in kind of these first 13 stories that I read, we don't get a lot of information about these northern snowy lands that Conan is from. They're described with just kind of the right amount of mystery to kind of make the whole thing kind of tantalizing. Like you want to get more information, but it's just kind of teased. Yeah, again, this is a reminder. I mean, you know, everyone thinks that modern fantasy started with Tolkien, but Tolkien didn't write The Lord of the Rings until the 1950s. This is a reminder that there are these kind of fantastic worlds going on in the 1930s. The other intriguing thing about Conan the Barbarian is just the prose style with which it's written in. A fellow friend and blogger, somebody whose blog I've been following, Whiskey Prager, is a big fan of Conan the Barbarian. He's got an interesting post, which I'll link to in the description, in which he talks about Conan the Barbarian being kind of like a Sylvia Plath for boys. The idea that Sylvia Plath is particularly attractive to a kind of goth type girl, or I don't know. Actually, that's probably a sexist statement, isn't it? But the idea is that these kind of more kind of emo or goth boys aren't going to be reading Sylvia Plath so much, but they'll be much more attracted to Robert E. Howard and kind of the interesting prose style he's got going here. I'm not doing a good job of summarizing that argument. I'll just link to his post down below. Now this has some points. I am a bit of a simpleton, so I like kind of nice, clear, straightforward prose where I know what's happening. Not everyone does. I had an 8th grade English teacher who would always try and he would always be praising these stories, which would start off with like these really mysterious sentences to kind of grab the reader. And I remember we had a lesson where he's like, look how interesting these sentences are. Don't they want to make you read more? And I remember thinking to myself, no, it doesn't make me want to read more. I want a nice, simple story like Once Upon a Time There Was a King, where I'm like, all right, I know exactly what's going on here. Tastes differ, I guess. But my 8th grade teacher would have loved these Conan the Barbarian's opening sentences. I mean, he would have hated the content of Conan the Barbarian because there's so much sex and violence in these stories. But he would have loved the first opening sentences. I'll quote from some of them. These are just opening sentences from some of the stories in this collection. So, the thunder of the drums and the great elephant tusk horns was deafening. But in Livia's ears, the clamor seemed but a confused muttering, dull and far away. That's the opening sentence. Or here's another one. A swift crashing of horses through the tall reeds. A heavy fall, a despairing cry. Another opening sentence from a different story. Hoofs drummed down the street that sloped to the wharfs. So in each of these stories, it would take me like 2 pages until I discovered what was going on. And I didn't fully appreciate that, although again, this is a preference thing. Some people will. I guess I'm more of a simpleton. But yeah, it does take you a while you just kind of get thrown into the middle of a scene in the beginning of each story, and then after a couple pages, it becomes clear what's happening. Yeah, Robert E. Howard's descriptions. So he has very descriptive passages, although there are certain words that he's fallen in love with. For example, the word supple. He loves supple. Whenever a female character appears anywhere in this book, she's going to be described as supple somewhere. So supple breasts, or supple arms, or supple legs. Occasionally, I even just caught supple popping up twice in the same page, which I thought was a little much. I mean, the word supple should never appear twice in the same page. Okay, going on more to talk about the sex and violence. There is a lot of sex and violence in this book, which surprised me because, I think we have this image of like modern media is really like bad with sex and violence, but that old stuff was different. The stuff our grandfather grew up with. And this is all the way back in the 1930s. But yeah, boy, lots of sex and violence. It's a reminder that things were not always so tame generations ago. There was some interesting stuff going on in pulp fiction, even back in the 1930s. Now, the sex is mostly implied. It kind of happens off screen, so to speak. The violence is fully on screen, all graphically described. And for whatever reason, Robert E. Howard really loves to talk about people getting disemboweled. I think there's about 1 disemboweling per story in this collection. So yeah, if you don't like sex and violence, you can stay away from these books. I actually don't mind a little bit of sex and violence in my entertainment. I know that's a whole nother debate about the effects sex and violence has in society. What I did find more disturbing, though, was the racism in this book. So there are racist undertones, kind of hints of kind of racial prejudice in a lot of these stories. But it comes fully up to the surface in a story called The Veil of the Lost Women. And in this book, it talks about black tribes abducting white women. And it's just full on playing up on this prejudice of, black men like to rape white women. The prejudice, that is. Robert E. Howard was a Southerner. And these stories are from the 1930s. So I guess you can imagine. But yeah, I mean, just quoting from the book, quoting from that story. At one point, Conan is talking to the black people, and he said, "You said I was a barbarian," he said harshly. "And that is true, Crom be thanked." Crom is one of the gods in this world. "If you had men of the outlands guarding you, instead of soft-gutted civilized weaklings, you would not be the slave of a black pig this night." You would not be the slave of a black pig. I'm misplaced this. He's talking to one of the white women. "I am Conan, a Cimmerian, and I live by the sword's edge. But I am not such a dog as to leave a white woman in the clutches of a black man. If you were old and ugly as a devil's pet vulture, I would take you away from Bajul. Bajul is the land. simply because of the color of your hide. But you are young and beautiful, and I have looked at black sluts until I am sick at the guts. Yeah, what do you say to that, huh? Yeah, and then later in the book, another quote. Conan speaking. He's talking about the black lands, the lands where the black-skinned people live. He says, "What would be blackest treachery in another land is wisdom here. I have not fought my way alone to position of war chief of the Banulas without learning all the lessons the black country teaches." So, yeah. What can you say? In spite of that, I guess I found these stories interesting. So, yeah, you know, there's a lot of classics that have racist stuff in them, and I think it's still worth reading. I don't know. Conan is a pulp fiction classic, so it's not a classic. But, you know, like, he's still a viable intellectual property. Like, Hollywood is still making movies about him. So, this stuff is still in our culture. Yeah, boy, I shouldn't have ended on that note. Boy, that's a depressing note to end on. Yeah, all in all, some interesting stories, some interesting prose. Don't approve of the racism in this book. Yeah, that's all I've got to say.